Have you wondered what financial advisors actually think about finances? This is your sneak peek at the conversations within Financial Design Studio. Michelle Smallenberger, the CEO here, will be your host as you go behind the designs.
Welcome back to another episode of Behind the Designs. My name is Michelle Smallenberger, a financial advisor here at Financial Design Studio. We work with professionals as they start to think about retiring with tax efficiency. Now, right now, we are in the middle of a mini series of case studies. We will introduce you to a fictional client and their fictional situation, and then we're going to share how we would dive in and shape their plan as financial advisors. And joining me today is our Chief Operations Officer and an advisor here at FDS, Trevor Meyer. Welcome, Trevor.
Thanks for having me. Always good to be here.
Yes, this is kind of different. Sometimes we're talking about one topic and, kind of how do you do this specifically or all the details around it. These have been kind of fun because it's talking about situations that we work with. So this kind of helps people to really see behind the scenes. So, Trevor, just to kind of get us started, when you meet a new client, where do you like to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's there's a tendency, at least on my part, and I sometimes have to rein this in, but there's a tendency on my part to kind of want to jump onto the low-hanging fruit, if you will. If there's like an obvious strategy that says, hey, this is something that could be beneficial both in the current cash flow scenario or tax scenario, and also in the long term, like I have a tendency to want to help clients implement something like that. But it also comes careful, because if you do that too often, you can really miss the bigger picture and miss what the true goal is. Because at the end of the day, it's we're working with clients to say we're not just trying to build up a big pot of money for you at the end. It's really about how can you build up the big life memories and the big opportunities that you get to experience throughout. So I think it's mostly on the low-hanging fruit, but if I actually dial that back, it's more about what are the things that they actually want to accomplish, whether it's retiring at a certain age or spending a certain amount or buying a home or any one of the number of things that generally kind of come up. So.
Yeah, I kind of think about it like when we were growing up, and maybe because our daughter's at that age where there's story problems in math class, it's like you get this story problem in math. Billy has 5 apples and they cost this. And, it's like you set that up and you're kind of like, okay, I know that it's going to cost less. You kind of generally know the answer, but you still have to do the math to figure it out. But I feel like it's kind of similar to that, where it's like this story problem and you're kind of get all these facts and all this information and you want to solve it and figure it out, the best way.
Yeah, it very much is like that. And for listeners that don't know, I'm very much a problem solver at heart. So I think it's a benefit to have other members on the team to say, hey, let's look at the broader picture sometimes, because I do have a tendency to jump into that. But making sure that you're understanding, hey, let's look at the full problem, not just solving the one individual problem. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things too. When you kind of start looking at all of the kind of the pieces that, okay, these are for sure things we know we can do. But then as a team, that is, part of our process, which we're going to talk about today. But the 4 of us really, I think of it as a way you kind of get these facts and you start thinking about them. And then, it's kind of you start thinking, and then the longer you think about something, you might get another idea and something, it becomes clearer along the way. And so that's really, how the 4 of us, when we come together, we've all been thinking about our clients and their situations. And so I think you just continue to get kind of better and better, results or opportunities kind of together as we're thinking about it. And so it makes this fun to do together also, as it's a new client and you're like, okay, let's figure this out. So yeah. All right. Well, no, this is going to be exciting. Hopefully this is also helpful for listeners. So with that in mind, let's kind of introduce our, clients that we're going to talk about today. So again, this is a fictional client and situation. It is very similar to a lot of clients that we work with, though. We work with senior business leaders, executives. And so a lot of these things are very common. So that's why we felt like this would be helpful. This is very common of the work that we do here at FDS. So let's kind of go ahead and set this up. So we have Curtis and Carly today, Kurt and Carly as our clients. And Trevor, why don't you go ahead and fill us in a little bit, just their professions and kind of when they're thinking about retirement?
Sure. So I think in our kind of fictional scenario that we talked about beforehand, so the scenario is, Curtis is a senior leader in a Fortune 500 company, and is what we would often be called as the primary breadwinner, whereas Carly primarily does work inside the home, but takes care of a lot of the administrative things just to make sure the home keeps running, because it's one of those things that while there's not pay necessarily associated, it's a lot of work to kind of keep a home running. So balance each other out in terms of, hey, providing resources, but also providing opportunities on both sides. So I think some of the other details are, they're about 5 years away from retirement. Trying to work through what are the strategies that they might need to implement as they prepare for that day, and kind of when that day comes. I apologize if there's some other things here. We talked about goals. What are the things that they really want to focus in and do in retirement, even now before retirement, and whatnot. So
No, that's helpful. Yeah. So yeah, in this situation, they're kind of nearing retirement within 5 years, hoping to retire kind of around age 56. So that is definitely early retirement, compared to a lot of people. So one of the biggest things here is making sure they have the funds to be able to do that. Why don't you talk us specifically with them, retirement, is this kind of an age that they've always been looking at and they're like, that's going to be the year, or talk us through kind of their thought about retirement and maybe what that looks like in choosing that date.
yeah, I think for this client, it was one of those situations where it wasn't necessarily pegged to a date to say, hey, by such and such date, I need to be retired and I'm not working anymore. It was more focused, and we actually see this quite frequently recently as well, where, hey, I can continue working. I'm doing enjoyable work. I'm having fun doing what I'm doing. I'm not pegged to a specific date or a specific age, but I do want to make sure that when I turn off the spigot, if you will, for income, it's especially like the high income that generally Curtis has, and also a lot of other clients that we work with, that they have before you turn that off. Is everything prepared, set aside, and coordinated to make sure that everything is in the right spot so that when that day comes, it's an easy transition, or as easy as can be, because the reality is every transition like that will be hard. And we do our best to come alongside and say, hey, how can we make it less hard? But this is something that folks have been doing for decades of their life, and it's hard to say, hey, tomorrow I'm not doing it anymore. So there is going to be a challenge, but yeah.
Yeah. And you're right. I feel like we have heard this a little bit more frequently, especially once we kind of have a plan in place for a client. I mean, I can think of a handful of clients where, even recently they've got a plan in place. And now kind of once they know they can retire, it really becomes more of this, well, I'm kind of choosing to work because it is fun, or there's this project, or, they're kind of trying to then plan out, well, when is that right time for me financially, but also emotionally and, physically, that I'm ready to be done.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes it can be extremely exhausting to manage a big, heavy, impactful and very important project, but it has weight, right? And if it's not something that really gives you joy and gets you excited to get out of bed in the morning, if from a financial perspective, we can work things in such a way so that, hey, maybe that's not a project you do need to take on. Recognizing that as you're coming to the end of your working career, so in Carter's case, that's what we're looking at. Hey, maybe he's not trying to say I'm looking for a big promotion before I step off the team, and instead I'm looking to kind of, hey, wind down, excuse me, the time at the company or whatnot. So.
Yeah, no, that's really good. Yep. No, it's really important for people once they're kind of choosing to retire, whether that's going to be a specific age or if they're saying, okay, this is the time, really knowing kind of what you're going to do after retirement, rather than trying to figure it out in retirement, which is perfectly fine too. But if you can think about it a little bit more, ahead of time, it does kind of make that transition into retirement away from working, like you said, where you've been for decades, maybe, can make that a little bit smoother.
Yeah, and whether that looks like, if you can transition or you've stepped into that transition, what would be a good number to approximate from a spending perspective, so we can have that as a target, recognizing that we're by no means requiring to say, hey, clients, you have to spend that, or you don't need to spend that much, or you can't spend that much. it's one of those things to say, if, hey, that's a general target, one, how fluid is that for you going to be? And then two, what are the things you're open to stepping into to help reduce it? So.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. No, there's a lot of facts like that that I think people aren't aware of that make such a big impact over the life of their whole finances. Yeah. Okay, so as we talked about goals, let's see. So, what are some of the concerns, I guess, when they're kind of thinking about retirement? Like, we think that's an exciting time and I should be excited about that, right? But let's talk about some of their concerns as they look at their, kind of financial plan. And then what are just some things that they care about?
Yeah, so I mean, I think one of the things I touched on earlier is a concern that Curtis has, stepping off the team at his Fortune 500 company is, what does life look like after the fact? This is something that you've been doing for decades and decades. And a lot of it becomes, your identity of who you are, of what you wake up and do in the morning. But at the same time, what does that look like after the fact? And there are ways to still continue to be involved, even from a work perspective, but maybe not such in a professional capacity. Maybe it's a volunteer position, or maybe it's just a part-time position to say you're still using a lot of the skill sets that you've honed in years and years and years, but just in a slightly different capacity, or maybe a not-for-profit, something like that. So that, I guess that's one concern, is like, what does the day-to-day look like? But then secondly, I think as we were kind of talking through for, Curtis, kind of working through, it's like, well, we have certain guideposts that we want to make sure from a confidence level that clients are comfortable stepping into retirement, recognizing any retirement projection that we run has to be based on assumptions. And the hard part with assumptions is we know that they're wrong. We just don't know how wrong they are, and we don't know how wide that gap is. So we want to be very careful and considerate while not being overly conservative and not being overly aggressive. So we like to look at a broad range of outcomes and say, okay, generally speaking, here's a target where we think clients might be comfortable. And those are kind of guideposts that we have internally, but that's a conversation that we stepped into with Curtis and stepped in to say, hey, this is where I think we normally start. This is actually where we project you to be. And in Curtis's case, the number was much higher. So he wanted to make sure that that number continued to stay at that level, because he wanted to make sure that Carly was fully well taken care of if something ever happened to him, which I think was really meaningful. It's one of those things to say, hey, he's going to step back a little bit from stepping into maybe more fun things or stepping off the team, whatever the case was, because he wanted to make sure that absolutely at no point would Carly's lifestyle ever change or have to change if something were to ever happen to him. So, guidepost is this, but in conversations with Curtis and Carly, we said, hey, let's bump that up. So that's what your guidepost is going to be. And what are the strategies and optimization tools that we're going to use to get you around that target? So
yeah, exactly. I think one of the big things kind of alongside that too is just, when you're trying to make sure that your plan works for them, they want to make sure they don't have to take on any debt or don't go into retirement with debt. So that was another big piece too, which is interesting. Everyone kind of takes, views different risks differently. And so it's interesting, but that was something, they need their plan to look really good because they don't want to have to make any changes like that. So that's helpful. Okay. So as we're kind of thinking about them, there's a lot of specific employee benefits and things like that, which we'll get into a little bit more. But kind of just give us your initial thoughts. Kind of what are you thinking after having met Curtis and Carly? Some of these facts, just hearing, what's important to them when they want to retire. What are some things that you're thinking now?
Yeah. So especially when it kind of came obvious that they would be looking for a retirement date earlier than what is quote unquote typical. A lot of times typical is 65, but I think more and more frequently we're seeing that is not a typical date. We're actually seeing much earlier, which is great. But as we're stepping into those conversations, one of the things that we want to be careful and mindful of is where are the income streams going to be coming from? So we want to make sure that Curtis and Carly have enough money to live on to fund their lifestyle until other income streams kick on. So one of the common things that retirees get is Social Security, and especially with some recent changes in tax legislation or whatnot, those are even more beneficial benefits. But that can be a substantial portion of your expense need that's covered from Social Security. So, generally speaking, most folks will be able to qualify for Social Security with a full retirement benefit at age 67. You can file as early as 62. You can file as late as 70. So the benefit amount you get would change. But if we're talking for Curtis and Carly to say, hey, I'm going to stop working at 55 or 56, well, gosh, even the earliest for Social Security, we've still got 7 years of expenses that we need to find a way to make sure covered. So expense was making sure that we had that clarified. And then, we start backfilling. We say, okay, well, expenses are going to come from this source. So one of those was deferred comp. So looking at some of the elections that might have already been made, one of those might be, continued equity compensation that's vesting after the fact. So one of the nice things, especially with larger companies, is if you hit certain retirement criteria, even if it's earlier than 65, in this case 55 or so, some of your stock options or RSUs can continue to vest even after retirement. Now, not every company allows that. Curtis's case, they do. So that's a huge benefit because that can help substantiate a couple of years. So it's kind of working through what are the expenses going to be, looking at it literally every single year, and then just penciling down, hey, we project X number of dollars to come from this source, and we project X number of dollars to come from this source. Are we meeting the expense need? Great, we've got that year covered. Let's look to the next one. So it's kind of tedious going through year by year, but we want to look at the detail because the last thing that we ever want a client to do is to say, hey, you make this massive life transition. You're not bringing in an income anymore, but now we're asking you to say, oh, we got to pull from another account because we didn't do the math properly.
Yeah, no, it's amazing how many, of these executives that we're working with, how many of these employee benefits or, executive compensation pieces, like you've mentioned, whether that's stock compensation or bonuses, or deferred compensation, these pieces that continue even after retirement. I know we'll talk in one of our case studies in the future, but, it's amazing how many people don't realize, your income can continue or be greater when you retire or after you retire, maybe for a year or 2 or 3, and then even when you're in retirement, when those RMDs start. So it is really important, that timeline of kind of here's when income's actually going to happen or what we're expecting, and then where do we need to make up if there's a gap. So yeah, that's a really great point. Our very first step, we're kind of gathering information, getting details. Where do we kind of start with a client? So with Curtis and Carly, where are we starting with them really to kind of make sure we know everything that's going on with them?
Yeah, I mean, so we've got a blueprint that we take all clients through. So this is part of our process. We call it a blueprint. It's basically a map of your financial life. And, the very first bullet point that we take every client through is what are your goals? What are the things that you want to get out of the remainder of your life? And for some people, that's, hey, maintaining the current lifestyle. Some people, that's, hey, I want to buy a bigger home. Some people, I want to buy a vacation property or move someplace. Other people want to, hey, I want to give away a certain amount of money. In Curtis and Carly's case, what we were looking at, the big thing that we first started working with them is just maintaining their lifestyle. We're just continuing the same kind of things that they were already doing. They had a child that was, adult grown, so the child was out of the house. So that's covered from that perspective. It's amazing how much your grocery bill can drop when you don't have a teenager in the house anymore. But yeah, kind of looking through some of those things. But then interestingly, as we've been working with Curtis and Carly, one of the things that we noticed was, hey, there became a need because the second branch that we get through is family. And, I already mentioned this, the adult child, but then also we talk about parents maybe, right? So, are there parents or are there other relatives that, you feel that you might be financially responsible for, or not even necessarily financially, just, relationally or emotionally, that you want to be able to come alongside. So it was interesting for, Kurt and Carly where, it was, hey, let's maintain lifestyle. And then a couple years down the line, we said, hey, something has happened. We need to adjust our setup here and our plans so that we can accommodate making sure that Carly's dad is taken care of. Kind of making sure I kind of going through that process of, hey, just make sure that the support's provided. And I think for their case, it basically looks like, let's buy a different house. Or, in a case, what I'm personally doing is I'm actually building, I call it a shed in the back of my property. It's a little bit bigger than a shed, but my hope is that my dad can actually, can move here. So it can take the form of a different form or different aspects. But yeah, in their case, it was, hey, let's shift from maintain lifestyle to, hey, we need to take care of family members. And how does that going to impact the plan?
Yeah, yeah. And this is really, it's interesting. Again, we kind of talk about, oh, we're hearing this recently a lot, or, we can think of several clients going through this. It is interesting, but we've had other conversations with other clients so similar to this, where even, the parent, as a client is saying, I'm going to move in with, my son or daughter over time. I know I'm going to, I want to help them purchase that larger home. And so what starts to become really interesting is there's so many different things to think through, but it really is interesting how there's a lot of people kind of thinking like this. And so this is kind of one of the specific things we're talking through today is kind of this, we've been working with them for a while. Their plan has been on track, but now something's changed. And, we need to kind of update the plan and see what options do we have? How should we do this best to not jeopardize the original, assumptions and planning goals that we had. So all right. So once we've kind of set that up, now we have all the information, we've clarified the goals, we've kind of revisited like that retirement timeline and cash flow. So very high level, we know kind of the facts of their situation, and that's been organized. Now we kind of start to move into what we call strategy. And this is really kind of that thinking process of, okay, well, now what can we do? We know the facts of their situation. And we were talking about how we dig in and we kind of get this high level of, okay, here's what's going on, and now how do we solve this case, kind of becomes part of that. So talk us through some of the important things as we start to think about strategy for a client and for them specifically. What were some of the things in this that we're talking about with kind of this change in their plan?
Yeah, so I think just generally, and I'll take a quick step back, is I'm a big believer in keeping things simple to the best extent possible. And the reason why is, we can get to the absolute best financial answer as we can based on the assumptions that we know. And it might involve, 20 different little changes here and there and tweaks. But the reality is the implementation of all those on the executed timeline gets really difficult. It can be done. We can take care of our part. Sometimes it's challenging to coordinate with clients at certain timelines to get all that done as well. So and I specifically like to say, okay, well, I am okay adding complexity, but I don't want to add complexity for complexity's sake. So if we can keep it simple, that's always a really great starting point. So specifically for Curtis and Carly, one of the things that we were taking a look at doing was, I think for some of the deferred comp that Curtis had elected through his employers, he had one election to say all of these things were going to vest right when he retired. And we started to take a look at that and said, okay, well, could we consider actually spreading some of that income out? And the primary point of that recommendation came from the aspect of we didn't want a massive tax bill for Curtis and Carly the year in which he retired, especially when there's a year when he probably has a lot of income already from his high-paying job. So now we're going to jump into perhaps the largest tax bracket available, and effectively have to pay substantially more in taxes than we would otherwise. Now, it's great to have those dollars. There's nothing wrong with adding more dollars and not being reliant on other folks. But if there's a strategy to say, hey, can we spread that out? And that's ultimately what we recommended, to say, let's spread that out over a time period. And I think in Curtis and Carly's case, it was some of the deferred comp we changed to 5-year elections, and some of it we changed to even 10-year elections. But we're really spreading out that income to meet their expense needs, to make sure that between 55, 56, we're covering those expenses till certainly Social Security and R&Ds kick in at later in life. But there's income coming in so that it's more like you're getting an income from a working career, but not the exact same because you don't have to go to the office every day. So that was one big change. I think one of the other things we kind of evaluated is just how we're going to handle some of the equity compensation. I think as I mentioned before, Curtis's company basically is really beneficial in the respect that if you hit certain retirement ages, when they considered retirement as eligible, some of those continued vesting. So that was always a plug that we had in our minds as well. So not that you're relying on it, but this is how it substantiates and helps the plan if we wait till a certain date. So those are two of the big ones that come to mind.
Yeah, I think it's also really helpful just to remind executives, a lot of times it's, I elected this, and so that is what it has to be. But a lot of times, like you really can, with some of these benefits, you can look back and you can make changes. Now, you may not be able to change it exactly how you want. You may need to make a change, and then that still has to be spread out over more time. But it can be beneficial to you. As we're really reviewing everything, we're looking at everything. Okay, from today forward, what changes can we make? Is there anything that is in place that we can change if we needed to or wanted to? And so it's, not necessarily looking at everything as permanent. It's looking at what are the options that we have? Like, what's the strategy we could do? So yeah, I think that's a really good point. Yeah. So that was kind of some of the big changes, I guess, as we're talking through how to buy a bigger home. So they're going to move from where they're at, coordinating like just a lot of those pieces together. I think this becomes one of the big pieces, kind of the tax impact of that. And then depending on, who's actually going to be paying for the home when, maybe talk us through, I guess, some of the options that they have or that they had when they were looking at this purchase.
Yeah, so this is something we're really fortunate that Curtis and Carly kind of invited us into when they were started thinking through the process, and I feel really blessed in the regard that our clients feel safe to share some of these big ticket items with us because of the fact it does have a material impact on their plan. But we would love to see how can we help come alongside you to make sure that as goals change in life, because more often than not they will. How can we come alongside you and make sure that you're meeting not only your original goals, but your future goals and hitting all those in stride, right? So for them specifically, when the idea came about, hey, let's look at a different property, it's interesting because a lot of the times we hear from clients that say, hey, kids are out of the house, I want to downsize, I don't need as much square footage, I don't like the upkeep, this and that. But in this case, Curtis and Carly wanted to make sure that there was ample room for a parent to kind of move in, but still maintain some of their own living space and still maintain some independence. And we have other clients that have kind of stepped into that where, their parent has moved into their existing home. In this case, Curtis and Carly said, hey, we want to move to a different one. Great. So functionally speaking and financially speaking, what we started looking at is to say, okay, well, let's assume the top end. What's that price of the house going to be? Let's look at your current home. Do you plan to sell your current home first and move? Or do you want to pay for this out of cash? Or do you want to take a mortgage? We basically want to lay out all the potentials, all the ones that make possible sense, and throw them out there to Curtis and Carly and say, okay, of these, are there any of these we can just wipe off the board right away? And I think one of the ones that was really apparent that they did not want to do was take on new debt. They had strived hard, and we walked alongside them to say, hey, let's get rid of the mortgage that they currently had. So adding them and asking them, hey, let's add a new mortgage. It kind of felt tantamount to what they had originally tried not to go against, right? Or tried not to have. So that one got wiped off the board, but now we're looking at, okay, we have the potential to sell the current property. We have the potential to buy the current property out of current assets that they have. Also, is Carly's dad able to support and step in and provide some funds there as well? I forgot to add that once before. But when you start looking at all these options and say, okay, if we do this, this, or this, what makes the most simplistic financial sense? In their case, it was to say, hey, we have enough cash that we're going to purchase the property directly. They did so, and the plan is to sell their current property and use the proceeds from there to help backfill some of their other savings. But kind of walking through to see what that looks like, now the question becomes, okay, does this have an impact from a financial perspective, specifically as it relates to tax? Well, in their case, no, because they sold their current home that they had lived in for the past couple of years, so they qualified for the home sale exclusion. So even though they bought it at a low price and sold it at a much higher price, none of that gain that they sold their home for was taxed, right? They had $500,000 of exclusion gained, or gain excluded, excuse me. So from a tax perspective, everything's net net. We're good to go there. From a savings perspective, they were able to pull savings from their existing, emergency fund or just high yield cash funds. But we were also walking through what does it look like to sell funds out of a joint brokerage account that they were saving into, and recognize some gains there, minimizing those to the best extent we can. And if we had to pull those, let's pull them. But essentially working through what needs to get done versus what can we work from otherwise.
There's a lot of options, and I think that's what's interesting. So there's, like we mentioned, there's several clients kind of walking through this, and these are the specific things I see them, like these are the options, where it's, can we fund it? Do we need to take a mortgage to fund it because of the timing? So you never know, am I going to be able to sell my home in time to buy the other one and apply that? And then you see, parents where they say, we want to give some funds, we want to gift some funds because we know I'm going to be living with you. I want to apply some funds to this to kind of help with, whether that's just the down payment or whatever that is. We're kind of seeing this more and more. And so it is interesting because you're going from like the parents and the kids living in their own homes. So you have two separate homes, but knowing at some point we're going to need to start giving some physical care, and we want to be able to do that. And so now we need to buy just basically one larger home, but who's actually going to own it? Who's going to fund it? And so some of those like specific details really become important because all of that can shape, like you just described, the taxes, even, for estate tax purposes, that can affect a lot of those conversations. So I think really, one of the interesting things I've noticed in these conversations is it's what do you want to happen, and kind of hearing like both sides. What do they want? What do they need? But I've seen it work really well because I feel like both sides, it comes together really well, in that everybody wants the same thing. And so it does get coordinated and does, work out to the best. But it's interesting because, it's, do I gift that as a lump sum up front? Do I give that, up to the maximum annual exclusion each year? And so you're kind of like all these different options. And so sometimes even too, do you think people have to think of like, what's the end scenario? Like, what do we, when this is all done, what do we want to have happened?
Yeah, I mean, that's one of the things that kind of came up is the titling for the new home. Whether the parent was going to have a titleship interest, and really kind of going back to keep it simple. We could include to say if we're adding funds from the parent to accommodate and coordinate some of that, okay, there can be an argument, add them on the title, all that stuff. But when you take a step at that, again, financially speaking, there could be a very good reason with which to do so. Step up in basis, exclusionary gains, stuff like that. But the issue that you come back to is now that's something that you have to remember for the future, which is not bad, but it is still a touch point. So if instead, let's just keep it simple. Curtis and Carly own it in your names, or actually in your trust. That was one of the other things that we helped walk them through of recognize they didn't have estate documents. So own it in your trust. And in doing so, we're kind of keeping things simple from an estate perspective, recognizing that, hey, there's no current state estate tax that we're concerned about. Federal estate taxes, we're in good shape, especially with the recent legislation that has kind of bumped that up and locked in a higher value. So we're looking at all these different variables that what's going to be a negative outcome, and how can that apply to their plan? And if that won't apply to their plan, then hey, it's not something we're going to have substantial concerns about. But yeah, as it relates to the titling, it's something that we talked about kind of internally, and actually even with Curtis, I believe, to say what is the absolute best titling, and kind of walk through is, okay, there could be financial reason, but functionally, it's probably simplest just keep it in your names. So.
And I think it's interesting too, because sometimes you have to kind of even ask the question, have you guys talked about, what's going to happen to mom or dad's estate when something happens to them? And it even like, you start to make sure, has everybody talked about this? Is everybody okay with this? Because there can even be siblings who may say, well, wait a second, like you're giving money towards them, towards a house. Granted, you're going to be living with them, but it may not make everybody happy. And so it does definitely kind of start to initiate some conversations, or or, some thoughts toward, okay, well, again, in the end, what do we want to have happen? Is this kind of accomplishing that? Yeah.
Regardless, whatever the financial answer is, from a relational perspective, one of the things that we do harp pretty regularly on is making sure that, if we're working with an older couple, Curtis and Carly are still relatively young, stepping into retirement, but making sure that regardless of your age, that you're having open, transparent, and just honest communication with anybody that might have a perceived idea of, hey, this is where funds should go, whether it's parents, whether it's children, whether it's siblings, anyone that might be involved, just having a conversation to say, this is what my current plans are. I'd like to invite you in to say, hey, do you have any thoughts or whatnot? Recognizing that, and I've said this before, hey, everyone has a voice, but not everyone has a vote. So always welcoming feedback and understanding it, recognizing it can kind of be a weird, somewhat taboo subject when you talk about money, but the more you talk about it, the less taboo it becomes. But yeah, so you're inviting people into that conversation and helping them make sure that everyone's on the same page. So no surprises.
Yeah, no, that's great. Yeah, so it's interesting because once you kind of introduce we've got this plan, we're on track for retirement, and oh wait, something major like this, and we need to use some of these funds. So is our plan still on track? And what do we need to be thinking of? That's some of the interesting things. That's why it's so great if you are working with an advisor, you have a plan in place, but when something happens, and I say when something happens because something always changes in people's plans. And so it's really when something happens, then we say, okay, well, let's just update it, see how that affects the future of your plan. And now you have all the information to make that choice with. So it's really helpful if you can just kind of make these changes really quickly. And, some of these happen. I always say once someone starts talking about buying a new home or moving, I always say, I'm like, oh, it's going to happen. There's sometimes people who are kind of like, it might be a year away, but once people start talking about moving or buying a new home, it almost always happens. And it usually happens pretty quickly after they start mentioning it.
Well, I mean, it's, you can think, how long have they been thinking about it internally, and processing through, and it's like, oh, should I, shouldn't I, and stuff like that. And then finally to say, if they're bringing up the conversation with their financial advisor, they've given it enough thought to say, hey, this is something material in my life. And hopefully, your plan is structured in such a way that you're not locked into literally only one way of doing things. There's flexibility, with, future success in that. So yeah, I 100% agree with you that more often than not, when a client brings up, hey, I'm thinking about doing this, we've got a couple months to make sure that we're talking internally, and also, hey, everyone's good on the team. Is there anything we need to be mindful of if a client decides, hey, we need to pull funds to take care of this? Tax-wise, are we covered? Cash flow-wise, are we covered? Estate-wise, are we covered? Making sure that all the nuts and bolts are addressed to make sure we can give a really solid financial answer that also helps them fulfill their goals. So
I think it's really exciting when, clients can make a change in their plan like that. And, there's something they weren't necessarily thinking of or didn't know that it would happen that way. But then they have the ability to do that. I think it's so cool, especially when you watch families saying, we're going to be living together, and that's just more time they're going to be together. And it also helps the parents to, live with someone to kind of be taken care of. Or even, it could be, I think of some of our clients who they're moving in with their family, but they can still function very well. They could live on their own for a lot, several more years. However, they're saying, let's go ahead and transition to this. And then over time, they're always kind of there and cared for and protected. And so when the time comes that they need more care, it makes it, maybe that much more easy. So I do think it's really interesting, but it's just very cool that, people are confident enough to make those decisions. So let's just talk really quick. Just kind of one piece I want to touch on is really kind of the coordination. So we've talked about like the employee benefits, the timing of, when they have income coming in. But I think that's really one of the specific things and why we really like working with kind of like these senior business leaders, executives, because there's so many moving pieces that do affect their taxes, whether that's today or in retirement. So talk us through just a little bit of, when we're thinking about this, kind of the coordinating of that income and taxes together.
the very beginning of it, it's one of those things that I think I alluded to it earlier, but we need to understand, okay, what are the funds that are probably going to go out? So what's our best guess is, what's the cash flow expenditure going to be? And now we're trying to itemize and locate sources that can backfill, can support, can fund that expenditure that's going out. Some of those are already structured. We have no control over whether those are going to happen or not. Some of those we have a lot of control over. So, as non-glamorous as it seems, a lot of times it's a situation we say we know that X is going out. How are we substantiating with A, B, C, D? And we're literally going down the line, and pinpointing to say, hey, that's going to come in. That's going to come in. And so on and so forth. So I wish there was like a magic bullet to say, oh, wave a magic wand and everything's sorted out. But it's one of those things. Going through the detail of understanding when certain cash flow items are going to hit is really, really important. So more specifically, what are those cash flow items that we're talking about? So deferred compensation, when is the payment from the Fortune 500 companies deferred comp plan going to hit Curtis and Carly's account? When are they going to materialize those dollars, get a direct deposit to their bank account? We know based on elections that it should happen within this month at this interval at this dollar amount. And we can nitpick to say, all right, how much needs to go for taxes, if any? Maybe we handle that separately. So that's a line item. Another one is the equity compensation, that continuing to vest and those deposits getting hit. Same idea as a deferred comp. When's that direct deposit going to hit the bank account? And what's the timeline and taxes held out with that? So we count and hold for all that little detail and then go back. Is there still a gap? Okay, where's that gap going to come from? Now we're actually looking at it to say, hey, in Curtis and Carly's case, we say we anticipate a gap of X number of dollars. We think that using this account, your trust account, your trust brokerage account at Schwab would be a really good source for making sure you have funding for that. Okay. We can set aside from the cash perspective and a trading perspective to say, we need to set X thousands of dollars aside that we know is going to come out of the account to your bank account so you can spend it, so you can live on it, so you can actually use the funds that you've worked so hard to save over your lifetimes. And for Curtis and Carly's case, I don't specifically remember the exact detail, but it's a regular detailing of cash flow is going to hit on regular intervals. I want to say it's quarterly, but I'm not positive on that. For other clients, it can be, hey, I just need a once a year distribution. I'm going to take my annual what I expect to live on, and if there's more kind of the end of the year, if I need more, hey, I need the flexibility to pull it. Other people say, hey, I just want to replace my paycheck. Maybe I'm getting paid every 2 weeks. Whatever was coming in net for my paycheck each and every month, I just want that transferred from one of my Schwab accounts and moved into my bank account. Great, we can come alongside any one of those. Even if it's multiple different accounts, where, hey, there's a funding that happens this account, there's a funding that happens this account gets funds, this account gets funds. We can get as nitpicky and as detailed as a client would like, really just to make sure that we're taking out the ambiguity, the concern, the transitional frustration with, hey, we're not getting a paycheck anymore, but the finances are still there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it can be set up, however, which gives people, I think, confidence. Now, do you notice, so for example, some of the things with early retirees, if they're retiring kind of before that age 65, they also have like higher health insurance costs kind of in that window before Medicare starts. Do you notice more people, I guess, if they're retiring earlier, do you feel like there's more opportunities for them to kind of do more tax planning, or does it really just depend on the factors of every client? Because some clients might even also have like a pension and pieces like that might start right away if they chose that versus a lump sum.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to give the quintessential terrible financial planning answer is it really does depend. Every single client is different. Even for Curtis and Carly and Joe and Sally that might work for the exact same company, might have the same kind of goal structure, depending on their finances and how they've structured them. Previous to kind of working with us, it could be a situation where, hey, for Curtis and Carly, we're able to do this, and this because it lines out. But then for what was it, Joe and Sally? It came up. Sorry, I was a name on the fly. But for Joe and Sally, we have to pull other levers and make sure that income is coming from other sources, because hey, that it wasn't set up, it wasn't established in the same way. So yeah, it really does unfortunately depend on each client's situation. However, one of the things that we do like to look at is to say, especially for people that are quote unquote retiring early. Again, I hesitate to use that word because, that implies there's a certain timeline of when you're supposed to do it, and I don't like that idea. But retiring earlier than age 65, how about that? For folks that are gonna, retire in their 50s and whatnot, a lot of times we want to look at the availability of optimizing their lifetime tax bill. So that often comes up in the form of utilizing Roth conversions to say, hey, in those years where maybe you don't have a lot of taxable income, maybe you still have cash flows and you have adjustments in money flows to support your lifestyle, but maybe it's not taxable to you. In those situations where if you have low taxable income, well, goodness, why not fill up those low tax brackets, the 10, 12, 22 brackets, so that later on in life, when you have to take funds out, because the IRS will force you at age 75, they're going to say, hey, you need to start taking funds out of your IRAs. If we get ahead of the game and say, well, I'll choose to take funds out earlier in life and pay a much lower rate in tax, well, that could be a really beneficial thing for your entire lifetime tax bill. So again, we don't know what future tax rates hold, but generally speaking, a lot of the folks that we work with, if we can focus on and making sure you're only paying, call it 20% or effectively 18% in taxes, that's a good spot to be.
Yeah, no, I think it's just a great point and I think sometimes people think, oh, well, if I retired earlier or later, if I'm right on time, like at that typical retirement age, there's something better, but it really does depend. And I think it's also interesting, just the timing of, even this income and the tax benefits that you have, it's timing. Well, what's the benefit of us today doing this? So maybe while I'm working versus when I'm retired. So it's really weighing kind of those benefits of doing something now versus waiting until retirement or both. And that's really what we're always kind of trying to time and coordinate together is when is it the best time to take that benefit? And that can determine whether you save into a traditional or Roth 401k. It's things like that can affect your plan in a big way. So yeah, that's helpful to understand.
Yeah, I mean, we have tools to kind of run through that, but I still will default to spreadsheets. I love spreadsheets. So trying to figure out whether it's now or in the future, looking at a net present value function and calculation. But it's one of those things to say, okay, what is the cash flow going to look like? And how can we, figure out the true financial answer, recognizing that that's one data point, but it's not necessarily a true family answer, which is really what we want you going after. So.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's great. Yeah. So as we so we've moved on from kind of strategy, coordinating everything together. Now kind of talk us to kind of this implementation stage. We take everything we've discussed and now we have our strategy and now it's kind of implementing it. And I think a lot of times people kind of think, oh, okay, you just kind of do what you did last year. And, but again, something comes up and how do we handle this? So kind of talk us through, I guess, now the implementation of, for them kind of this, the sale of their home, the purchase of the new home. And then we'll kind of talk just about implementing plans in general.
Yeah. So I think for Curtis and Carly, the first thing that we wanted to look at is recognizing that their plan wanted to substantially change of, hey, we were expecting this, now we're expecting this, which included the home purchase. The first viewpoint is, hey, what is your tax bill going to look like? And is that going to substantially change from a financial perspective? And once we kind of clarified that it wasn't going to substantially change, okay, hey, we're good. Now we need to understand cash flow wise, implementing to make sure, hey, where is the cash going to come from? What are all the sources available? What is the most efficient way with which to pull those funds? Is it the high yield savings account? Is it the trust brokerage account? Is it perhaps even one of the retirement accounts that they've saved into? And we itemize and go through that entire list to say, well, what makes sense? What doesn't make sense? Not just today, but also 20 years from now. Like what is the impact of taking the funds from those accounts, not just today, but what does those account balances look like 20 years from now? Trying to understand all of that. So implementing is figuring out what is the true impact going to be, and then actually say, hey, if we need to move funds, are we doing wire transfers? And we talk with clients that say, we're kind of annoying when it comes to wire transfers, because as we're helping clients, get those done, we verify multiple different times. What are the wire instructions? Are they provided directly from the title company? We're going to verify with the title company to say, we have this closing on this such and such date. You're expecting this amount of wire. Can we verify, verbally confirm all of these instructions? Oh, and by the way, after the wire is done, we're calling again to verify, is that wire actually done? Do you guys see the funds in your accounts? Because the absolute last thing that I would ever want to get a phone call from a client on, hey, Trevor, I'm buying a house. The title company is not seeing the wire of the funds. What's going on? Like the immense pain and shock that I would have in that is something went wrong. And we don't ever want that to happen. So
like making sure all of the little details, making sure funds are there before closing. So it's knowing, I think that's where sometimes, you can have, here's what we're going to do, here's the strategy behind it, but the implementation of it can become tricky, because especially when you're thinking about selling and buying a home, there's so much that has to line up. So even, okay, the home we're purchasing, do the sellers for that home, do they want what we want? Just kind of the timeline of when we want to close and pieces like that. So, okay, we're buying something, then we're selling ours. Okay, like ideally those lined up. So that was great. In this situation, those lined up really well. And so sometimes it's even, there's just a time where you have to wait to see if that even works out. So in their situation, that worked out really well. And so then it was, okay, now we eventually need to transfer those funds. So for them, this was very smooth, which is what we always want, but doesn't always work out. And so even within that, saying, okay, well, what if this doesn't happen? Then what do we need to have in place? So yeah, so I guess when we talk about implementing things, but kind of talk us through other thoughts, maybe specific to their, implementation of their actual home sale and that process, and then anything in general.
Yeah, I mean, this didn't apply for them, but one other thing that popped in my mind, excuse me, is do we need to establish and make sure that any powers of attorney are pre-prepared, right? Maybe they can't attend the closing. They're on a vacation out in Italy, and having a really great time in preparation for retirement in the next couple of years. But the opportunity came up to present, or to purchase a home. So this didn't apply for them, but we've seen situations where it has. A lot of times, you don't have to be present at closing, but the way to affect and make sure that closing happens, whether it's buy side or sell side, do you have a power of attorney set up in place? Do you have a document that's actually legally drafted that makes sure it's valid, so that someone can act on your behalf? So that's another thing that popped in my mind. I'm trying to think what else. I think we talked about just the cash flow. We talked about the different options. I mean, we could talk about rebalancing, but their portfolio. That's one of the things that Rob does a really effective job of. Hey, Rob, we're going to need $200,000 or $300,000 of cash in order to purchase a new home here. What is the tax impact going to be? What is the timeline of those trades need to be? How can we do so in making sure it's an efficient way from an investment perspective, but also efficient from a tax perspective, so that we're not needlessly selling the position that has the highest gain for the client. And looking at situations like that. So those are the things that come to mind. I'm sure I'm missing something. So if something else comes to mind for you.
No, those are helpful, because that's where I think a lot of times people kind of think, okay, I bought the house and now we're done. But that's where some of these follow-up pieces, making sure, the documents, the house was titled in the trust, it's making sure a lot of those things happened. So no, exactly what you're saying. It's rebalancing your portfolio because we took funds out. So exactly like you're mentioning. Another conversation that came up, and this reminded me of just kind of like the level of detail when we're talking about, like in this scenario, we're talking about retirement. But one other conversation, and it's not the same, but when we were talking about like funding college, this conversation came up, for a client. This is very similar. We're planning for retirement. We're planning for college for our kids. We know they're going to go someday. We know we're going to retire someday. Okay. So that's maybe 5 years away. And then we get to where, okay, now that's 1 year away. And you talk about it, each year leading up to it, and you kind of refine more of the details. But now it's, okay, well, we're doing that next month. Okay, we have the tuition bill, and now we need to do this. Oh, but wait, like the plan that we had, now there's new information, and do we need to change something? And I think it's just so interesting, just the number of conversations that happen about some of these things, these transitions or these things like, one of your children going to college. There's so much planning that does need to happen. There's the high level planning. And then there's just okay, what's the nuance of how this is actually going to happen? The cash flow of when am I going to do this and when is it going to finish? And so I think just it's interesting, as you get closer to these things, there's so many more conversations. But all that, don't you feel like that just helps people kind of to plan and be prepared just in case something comes up, because sometimes we're even telling people now, just in case, this happens, this is why we do this. Do you feel like that's, really helps people to maybe even mentally prepare, emotionally prepare for that event or that thing actually happening?
Yeah, well, 100%. It's one of those things that you can talk about it till you're blue in the face, but until you're actually that step and you're actually moving money from one account to another one, whether it's college, whether it's retirement, home purchase, whatever the case may be, up until that point, it was all theoretical. The moment it gets practical and the moment you're seeing those funds leave your account, because more often than not, we see it leave the account for a variety of purposes. Now it's like, was this really the right decision? Did this go through? And, to be able to come alongside a client and say, hey, yes, this was the right call because you're able to accomplish this, all because of the stuff you've done well before that, is an immensely rewarding experience. So I personally love stepping into those conversations, and, being a sounding board for clients and reminding them to say, hey, I don't care what happens, what fears or anxiety that might come up. If you feel something in that moment, please do not hesitate to call us, to let us know, send us an email. One of the things that we strive hard to do is in the moments where there's transition, college, retirement, home purchase, whatever the case may be, when there's a massive transition, in that moment, we want to do everything we can to make sure that you are as informed and comfortable with that decision, because we've done all the legwork ahead of time, knowing this is a sound decision financially, and this is an even better decision from a family perspective. So.
Yeah. Yeah. And this can take different shapes and forms. It can be moving closer to your kids when you retire. It can be, even other family. It can be siblings or loved ones. So it is very interesting how so many people outside of a financial plan can shape your financial plan, So no, this is great.
Caveat is just to remind folks, we are not technically counselors. Sometimes it's, hey, we step into conversations of, hey, there's a lot of stuff going on. But I think that also goes back to, making sure that your mental health is strong and on point, is a really important thing. So, we partnered with, mental health counselors to make sure that, clients can talk with people if need be. But it does sometimes kind of feel like that scenario where we can, feel like that. Recognize we temper client expectations, or we know the numbers, but there are certain really important conversations to be had if it steps up to certain lines. So
I think that's one of the great things is as we're working with clients, it really is, we're really trying to bring confidence through clarity in their finances. So as we can clarify all these details as they're leading up to those events happening, that just helps people to be able to be confident so they can live more and give more. And that's really what we want. And I think this is one of those perfect things. It's living more with those that are really close to you, that you really want to be surrounded with, that really makes life meaningful. So yeah, I think that's great. Anything else you can think of? I think this has been really helpful to kind of walk through a specific client situation, how we think about it, the outcome.
Yeah, I mean, nothing else is immediately popping in my eyes. I kind of getting jazzed up just thinking, I don't know, when you think about the numbers on a regular basis, it's like, hey, the numbers mean something, but when you actually think of the impact, it means something different. So I found myself getting excited for clients stepping through that. So
yes. Exactly. That's why we do what we do. This is fun for us when we can see people living it out. Yeah, it makes it really fun and intentional and meaningful. So, yep. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining us, Trevor. On our next episode, we will introduce you to another fictional client that has retired but realized that they aren't doing things right. You can join us to listen to how we would help them correct financial mistakes. You can find a couple related resources, especially when it comes to caring for aging parents, in our show notes. We'll have those listed on our website. And if you find yourself wondering if you are really maximizing your executive compensation, that's where a team like ours can really help you. You can reach out to schedule a meeting on our website at financialdesignstudio.com, and we will talk to you in our next episode.
Thanks for listening. To find any links or resources related to this episode, check out our show notes. Your host was Michelle Smallenberger, a certified financial planner and CEO. The guests featured are from Financial Design Studio, a team of experienced, fiduciary, fee-only advisors based in Chicago. Anna Lewis is the executive producer of the Behind the Designs podcast. And as always, for more information about Financial Design Studio and who we are, check out our website, financialdesignstudio.com. And final note, no content discussed on this podcast should be taken as financial advice. Financial Design Studio accepts no responsibility for your individual choices. We'll see you in the next episode.